All right, let's go. Wagwan sailors, how's it going? Today we'll be doing a breakdown on my latest material, just looking into general tips, how to uh, render your materials, and some bonus footage, which I think will be useful to a lot of material artists who are looking to get in the industry, but just generally how to really push your renders a bit more than just a simple sphere or a plane. So let's get going. Right. Just as a firm disclaimer, this isn't going to be a micro detailed breakdown on every single node, more of an oversight of why I've done certain things, some tips and tricks, and just generally how I've built the general material. But of course, this material will be made available for free, so you can experiment and explore how it was built from the ground up in your own time, so you can fully understand it. The table of contents, we're going to start off first and foremost with just analyzing the reference. Obviously, in my case, it's going to be a single image, but typically when you work on a material, you might be working on just a single reference, either from your art director or concept artist, or it's just generally a collection of references. Of course, the majority of the talk will be breaking down the material itself. I think that's probably going to be the most 40 minutes of the talk, hopefully. How you can potentially turn a material into a more usable tool, not just making a one-off material that's going to be used in X, Y, and Z scenario. We're going to be showing how to render this material in Substance Designer directly. And fifth point is pushing your presentation, which I'll hold off to surprise towards the end. And of course, the 15 minutes for a Q&A. Okay, so let's get going. So these are my two references, mainly the one on the left-hand side here. This was captured when I went camping in, I think it was Snowdonia in Wales, and it just caught my eye because I just thought it would be very fitting for the current scene that I'm making. And initially, I was just going to use it to try and make a specific tool out of it, and I intended to just make like this mesh decal type puddle with all these stones around it. But of course, you can't just always just make the tool directly. You sort of make the material first, and then you try and figure out how can I build the tool out of it, right? And of course, very fitting with what I've got here in the main reference. I've got this lovely piece of clumpy grass that just seems very fitting to the main reference. So I use that to add as an extra element to the material to just really break it up, basically, because the general consistency of it is just very gray, very dark, mid-tones should I say. So adding a new element just brings out a bit more contrast in the material. Of course, the main material is consisted of the main puddles, and for this we're going to be using the water level node that is built directly into Designer. Okay, so regardless on what material you're working on and potentially your experience, it's always worth trying to break down your reference for a few reasons, mainly to make your life a bit easier in terms of what elements are built into the surface, to try and make it more manageable rather than just looking at a piece of reference and thinking, oh crap, how the hell am I meant to make this? So breaking it down into more smaller components, just like any environment, is typically a good thing to do. And secondly, because it's just easier to do this way, basically, in my professional opinion. Okay, so we've also got the main puddles. The soil as well is very simple, so it's not really got a lot of detail basically into it. It's just some lumpy, compacted ground that for this particular reference, it had loads of people walking on it, and obviously from all of the erosion from the mountain or the rocks, it just compacts the soil. So as you can see, the actual reference itself is very flat, whereas in the background, as you can tell, it's got a lot more undulations and bumpy terrain. But this is just typically to just push the material to make it look better. Okay. Next, we've got the primary elements, which are the wet stones, which are obviously in the water itself. Okay, so as we can see here, they all have this particular section have a different color, different value that they respond to lighting, and how they are typically meant to be structured and scattered about. we've got the outer stones, which are the much lighter stones in value and in their opacity and their brightness. So we'll be looking at those, how we can build those. And of course, finally, we've got the grass itself as the more organic element that makes the material. Okay, so that's what I typically do to just break down my material to try and think ahead. Okay, how am I going to build this material to, in a dedicated time that I've been given either from production, if you work in the games industry, or just, typically you don't want to spend too long on the material because either you'll get bored of it, or you'll just potentially not even finish it. All right, so without this, let's jump into Designer. And towards the end of this, we're going to look into how I've built the material into a dedicated tool. But just as a note, the general build of the material is pretty much identical, but I'll go into a bit more detail what I've done to make it into a tool. Okay, so let's go. So this is the general material structure that I've got over here. So we'll be starting from the left-hand side to build the soil, which is the base of the material. And what I usually do is I usually have something called a debug preview, which is basically a simple material that I can visualize just the general definition of the nodes. Because when you look at the combination of these two noises, it's quite difficult to try and understand how they relate to an actual 3D perspective. So I've got this node over here that takes the height map and converts it to a normal map, height and ambient occlusion, mainly because I want to see a direct 3D render of what it looks like, and just plugging in a single input like so and not having to do anything else makes it super easy and very, very fast. Okay, so as we can see from the reference, typically it's just a simple purlin noise to try and get the water build up in the dips of the material, right? So that's the first node that I use to build the surface. And I introduce a bit of random noise to just break it up, and I just start structurally adding a bit more and more detail. So starting from big to smaller details, which is how you typically should build your materials, but obviously not just materials, but just environments as well. You obviously start from the big shapes, moving down to the more micro details. Okay, so we'll be constantly taking a look to see what the material looks like. So let's increase the intensity of the norm map so we can see a bit more detail. So nothing really happening right now, but as we add more and more details to the general surface, and like I said, even if I'm going a bit too fast, that's fine because I'm just trying to make sure I cover everything. You will be able to see this in a bit more detail. What settings I've used, what blur values, the opacities on certain things later on when it's made available for free. Okay, so I'm starting to add a bunch of details to get the general surface of the material. Okay, so I've got my general highs and lows on the soil. Okay, so let's keep adding a bit more detail, and I think this is something that you'll go back and forth when you work with materials. Like, just because you put in a low value of 0.1 at the very, very beginning doesn't mean it's going to translate very well at the very end of the material. So quite often you'll be going back and forth, adjusting certain values, and this is where making sure you always look at your height, normal, and ambient occlusion first is the most important part, because adding color or general roughness is only going to distract you later on. Okay, so give that a second. We're just going to start breaking up the surface with the clouds 2. Good old clouds 2. You can never be disappointed by clouds 2. Okay, and at this point I'm fairly happy for the general shape that I've got over here. So let's start adding just some details. Okay, so I'm taking this original height map that I've got over here, removing all of the high frequency detail to just capture all of these nice micro features that we're going to be blending on top. Okay, so you can start, there you go, you can start seeing a bit more definition and detail in the forms and structure. Okay, So at this point, it's not really about, oh, should I be using this node with this node? It's really just about, at this point, so early on in the build-up of the graph, just throw stuff together, and if it works, it works, okay? And just go back and iterate it later on when you've built the final height map and you're happy with it, okay? Then you can go back and iterate on stuff, okay? So at this point, I've got my more medium forms, let's call them, because that's what they kind of look like. So I'm going to start adding some surface detail, and they're very subtle. I mean, you might think, oh, you've got all these nodes over here, and it barely does anything, and that's fine. As long as it adds a certain amount of detail to your shape, then that's what matters. The only times it becomes an issue is when you start building really, really big graphs, and every time you make a new frame for a different part of the graph, you add loads of unique noises like purlins, moisture, grunges. If you use loads of instances, the graph will just get generally more and more heavy, especially if you want to recompute certain features, like to get a different variation. That can really slow things down. So just keep in mind that yes, you can throw as many nodes as you want, but just be mindful of how many you do throw, basically. Okay, so there you go. We're starting to add a bit more of these pitted details, which are coming through quite nice. And now, obviously, as I'm making this, I constantly check my reference to see, okay, what kind of features can I see into the soil right now? And you might think, well, this soil right here, you could just be making something as simple as a Perlin noise with some black and white spots, some blurs, and just boom, move on with the next phase, which, as we can see, the majority of the detail comes from the structure of the pebbles, the stones, the way they're laid out, the texturing, and of course the actual puddle itself. So don't get too bogged down on one specific element. Try and get to 80% of the material. I don't want to say as quickly as possible, but almost like time yourself, or at least put a limit on how long you spend on it, because you don't want to spend 2 days working on the base soil and you've not done anything else, and you've got to present it to your art director or to your lead, for example. Then you get probably in a bit of trouble. Not that anything would happen, but you want to be conscious of how much time you take. So if we keep going back and forth on the details over here. And one little tip that I can give you is, as you're adding details to your height map, it can be very difficult sometimes to try and see what actually happens in your height map, mainly because it's just so muted, a lot of the details. Okay, so even if you zoom in and you go back and forth, it's very difficult to see actually what's changing. So if you look at the ambient occlusion or the normal map, that will give you a much better indication of what is actually going on. You can see here, I'm punching a bit more of the details. If I go again back and then forward again, there you go. It's just doing a bit more curvature detail over there in the surface. Okay, so we're just adding layers of different detail, and it doesn't have to be anything again specific to the main reference, because at this point you just want to add more micro information, more micro detail that you can typically get from noises like fractals, black and white. Spots work very well because they've got real high frequency detail, especially if you work at resolutions of 4K, which is what I would recommend to do anyway when you build your graphs, because later down the line, when you've finished the material, you can export it at the target resolution of 1024, 2K, whatever your platform is. Not that you even have to do one, just do it for 4K if you want to. Okay, so at this point, I'm adding some peaks to my surface over here. I think there was a part in the reference over here where, if I remember correctly, it just looked like it has some nice undulations. Can't exactly remember from where, but you can kind of see it maybe here in the further distance where it's more glancing the angle. And at this point, I'm thinking about possibly blurring the bottom base to match the reference a bit more, because it's more shallow, this type of, well, I think it is anyway from the reference, this particular reference. because it will mean later on when you scatter your pebbles, for example, the angle that they sit at will be slightly different rather than flush and directly top down. Okay. So to blur that, all I'm basically doing is just using the histogram, I think it is select, yeah, histogram select, to just basically pick the very bottom of my map, of my height map, which as we can see over here. You're only picking this big massive dent over here, and then we're adding a bit of noise to just break it up, a bit of slope blur. And at this point, I'm just actually experimenting to just see what kind of other effects I can try and get together with shadows, non-uniform blurs, to try and just make it a bit more organic, the general material surface. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. If I actually just bump up the displacement at this point to see it a bit more better, maybe that would be easier. There you go. You just get a little bit of a undulation with these type of bumps, and you can actually imagine these type of material definitions. They're like, people walking in the puddle, or pieces of rocks have fallen from the cliff and they've landed in the puddle, and they've caused these further bumps in the material. Okay, and I'm doing this a couple of times for both the bottom and I think the actual top as well. Let me just double check. Yeah, so I'm just clamping the very top of it just a tiny bit, and I'm doing the exact same method, but just using the histogram scan to pick the whiter details from the surface. Okay, and I'm using the histogram range to basically just try and clamp my values. If we look at the luminance on the histogram, you can see that it's being clamped a little bit. And I'm using the ambient occlusion map over here to just get some various details from the material, to try and add some specific blurs to the top of the material, rather than just doing a straight cut on it. So if we try and see a before and after, yeah, you can sort of see that not the entire top of it is being cut off. It's just like yeah, there you go. You can see certain details are being softened, but the peaks are being preserved. And this is from the ambient occlusion map, where I just invert it and I clamp it slightly to get some nice details from there. Okay, so moving on, we have the top soil detail, which is just another type of detail that I wanted to add, like superficial detail. So if we take a look here, all it is just literally just a bunch of micro noise that we can somewhat see scattered actually in the reference here. I mean, it's quite hard to tell. I only use the iPhone to take this, but just looking at the general reference, you get sort of these squiggly little pixels, these little worms type effects. And when I was thinking, okay, what kind of node can I use? Plasma came to mind straight away. And as you can see, I used the transform 2D to really, push the amount of micro detail I had here. And I use a multi-directional warp, because the reason why I like to use the multi-directional warp is because over other warps is because it preserves the general position of certain features, well, the entire feature of the shape. So for example, if you're using a directional warp, if I'm sure most of you have used that, the directional warp pulls it into a certain direction, right? Because it's got the angle over here, whereas the multi one does it in multiple directions and then blends the two of them, well, blends the angles using these modes. Okay, so that can be really powerful to to make sure you preserve, for example, the scattered pebbles that you've got into that exact position, because typically when you scatter, let's say, pebbles or some atlas texture, you generally want to try and keep it in the same position, because if it conforms to the surface height, it might look a bit odd if it suddenly shifts, a 180 or something quite aggressive into the height map. So you just want to be quite careful when you use that, which is where the multi-directional warp comes in handy. And I'm doing some subtle blurs over here to just break them up ever so slightly to get some nice detail. And what I usually do, and what I try and tell all of my students, is when you blend different noises together, try and have some sort of noise. Well, even though I'm not actually doing it right here, try and have some noise plugged in um, to break up the different intensities that it gets blended. So, for example, something like this, if you didn't have this opacity map in here, right, you can see all these nice gradients, all these lovely ranges of grayscale pixels. If you didn't have this, everything would be blended at exactly the same intensity, which sometimes it can work, but for possible realistic materials, that typically isn't the case. So even if you just put a simple noise that has, a medium to micro range information, that will generally make it a bit more natural looking. Okay, and at this point, I've got my what's going on here. I've got some more terrain definition, and I quite like to use this effect over here because it's just a nice um, it's like a nice erosion effect that you can get in the material. It doesn't always work, but from my experience, it's quite successful. And I'm using this with the dirt too, and just generally a blurred micro noise and blended with, actually, as you can see here, with the previous noise to break up this continuous streak of the same opacity. Okay, so it just breaks it up ever so slightly. And at this point, I've got my final soil surface that I'm happy with for the current buildup of the material. Okay, so at this point, I'm thinking about, right, next part of the material, as we've discussed in the reference and analyze part, is the stones. Okay, the little pebbles that we have over here. Okay, so typically, I'm sure most of you have done this. Typically, you build something in a tile generator or tile sampler to try and scatter your pebbles, but I wanted to do something a bit more different and just generally try and explore some different methods. So if I just show what I did and then show how I've done it, will probably be a bit easier. So this is the atlas that I've basically built for these scattered stones that we have over here. They're not exactly 100% the same shapes, but they're pretty close in terms of the general structure and the forms that they are. The actual detail itself comes later on, okay? And there's a couple of reasons why I've done it in this specific way, and I'll explain in a minute. But before we go into that, I'll start off with a simple, this is literally a cells for, if you are curious. Okay, so it's exactly this. If you're thinking, oh, why didn't you just use that? It's just another method, basically. And at this point, I'm starting to break my surface, and I'm using crystal node, and this is a great node for organic surfaces like rocks, because it just generally creates big detail punches to break up the material, rather than using something like a Clouds 2 or a black and white, which even if you blur it, it's still a very soft noise, which it won't look great for what I was trying to do. So crystal is a very good node to break up the an organic surface like a rock, for example. And I'm doing this at different levels of intensity. So you can see here how it's changing the shape. Okay, and again, good example where I'm preserving the general position of the cells by using the multi-directional warp grayscale node. Okay, and then finally I'm doing a Clouds 2, and the reason why I'm actually using Clouds 2 at this point, because Clouds 2 is, even though it's a micro level noise, it's one of the noises that features more high frequency, more bigger forms in the detail compared to like a moisture, for example, or a black and white, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And at this point, I'm starting to try and figure out, right, let's get the general structure of these pebbles. So we've got an edge detect, and then we're going to be pushing them back out to try and fill these gaps to basically maximize the pixels that we're using later on, because you'll see later on here, if I was to use this compared to this, basically, you're losing a lot of pixel data, which could be beneficial to the final material, okay? So always try and push your pixels using the distance node when you can. And I'm using another edge detector to just basically get some nice crisp edges, doing a simple slope blur, again with the crystal node, to just get these nice big forms to just break up the surface, because as we can see, it just looks very, it still looks quite organic and quite straight, basically. Whereas this way, you're starting to introduce more breakup. And the flood fill only picks up on the pure white pixels, which is actually working in our favor because it gives you these nice crisp edges. Well, these type of details in the shape. And again, we're going to be using the flood fill to grayscale. And this is something that I've only actually experimented a few times, but this is a great way to just pick out certain elements from the flood fill, which is a perfect example for creating your own unique atlas. Okay, so we use the flood fill to basically pick just the inner components. Okay, again, we're going to run this through a flood fill, and that's the general sort of atlas for the before the sculpting happens. All right, so I've got a couple of shapes over here. I've got these beveled polygons and shapes, okay, and I'm running it through a flood fill mapper, which basically takes your flood fill map, okay, and allows you to scatter in each one of these cells a specific type of noise, basically. And as you can see, this works great in our favor because it allows to get these nice, if I pull auto levels down so you can see a bit better, these details, and it just makes it look more organic and more like a pebbly surface. And basically, I don't think I actually use many settings to tweak it over here besides just a general scale. And the great thing is that these shapes are always preserved inside of this, so you don't have to worry about, oh, they're going to bleed outwards and have any issues. And again, we're just going to get a simple flood fill over here, run it again through another flood fill, and this is where the actual general pebbles get created. And I'm using the Cube 3D, which I think was introduced a couple of versions ago in the Substance Designer, and it's a great node because it's got these interesting 3D shapes that allows you to create exactly these type of scattered little pebbles, which I'll show you in the renders how 3D it makes the material look like. And again, I'm using a crystal node, and you might have noticed I've mentioned crystal a lot of times. This is a good opportunity for you to go back and basically swap out any duplicate noises that you have that have the same level of like the same values. So even though you're making a new one, that cost gets added onto the final material. Okay. So if you're using the same cloud 2 on the same scale, the same disorder value, the same random value, try and collapse them into one single one because it's going to be faster. Okay. So again, I'm using the flood fill mapper over here to scatter all of these shapes over here that we have, and we start to get these kind of interesting cubes over here. We're going to auto levels them to make sure they use the full range, and we're going to start clamping them to later blend. Okay, as we can see here, you're blending them with a min darken because that's how you get these basically blends of different angles together into the same shape. As you can see here, if you look here, this is nice peak over here, but when you blend it, it's sort of like it's almost like a trim dynamic effect that you get in design in ZBrush. It's kind of like that basically, if you want to try and think of it in different program terms. And I'm using a random grayscale to just basically introduce some different height information over here. It's very, very subtle, but it is there. Okay, so I'm starting to break up again my surface with more crystals. I'm doing a simple bevel on the surface to just add basically some more 3D effect to it, and I don't know how well you can see, but it just adds a nice detail to it. And actually, hold on, I can use my debug, which is a good example to show how it works. Ah, there you go. That's how this is a good way to see how your pebbles can look like, and you can see it looks quite nice, you know. So we're blending it again with the bevel, and we're just doing a final min darken. Sorry, my mic went muted today. Get the final polish on them. Now we're going to start adding a bit of detail to them to basically break them up. We're starting to add some more medium forms and just some micro detail that we can actually see in the reference. And even though it's quite hard to tell on some of these pebbles, trying to find an example. You basically get almost like these erosion lines that run through the material, and I do that with a quantize, which you get almost like this stair-stepping effect. Okay, so I blend that later on into the final material. So if we just look at the quantize on its own, it looks like that basically, which almost looks like Minecraft. Okay, so we're blending it with the original shapes, but we're just doing some subtle details into the material at this point. Okay, so you can see here, you're taking it from this sort of stair-stepping effect to something a bit more organic. And I'm blending it back into the original surface with this angled flood fill that is multiplied or overlaid, should I say, with a random noise to just break up the opacity blend information that we have here. Because if you just imagine you've got this plugged in, the blend information is just going to be linear, you know, start to finish, just continuous. Whereas if you introduce some noise, it just, again, it makes it feel more organic. And this is pretty much my final atlas. And the reason why I actually use this method is because typically when you use a tile sampler or generator, you can only have 6 inputs, which is quite limiting in my opinion. That's one reason. A second reason is because when you texture your material, you typically want to get from your scatter nicely random grayscale values to basically texture each individual pebble. But with the tile sampler and generator, if the cells are merged like so, when you put a flood fill down, as we all know, you get these big chunks of collapsed information, which is no good to us. However, if you've got something like this, okay, and you plug this into the metallic input of the mesh of the Atlas scatter, when you get the output, you get this nice, random pebble information that you can later blend on into your base color over here. Okay, so this is another reason why I adopted this method. Okay, so the settings for the Atlas scatter, they're nothing fancy or complicated. The only thing that really changed was the mask random. Of course, I wanted them to be on a specific placement because, as the title says, this is pebbles in puddle. So these are the ones going to be in the water. They're going to have their own information, their own color, which are going to be later blended. Okay, and the next part, we've got the big pebbles that are outside on the top, which I think are meant to be like these more grayish, darker values. And if we look at the mask, yeah, they seem to be on the outer side of it, of the pebbles. Okay, and I'm doing another pass to introduce a almost like a medium micro level of detail into the surface to just blend these two together, this pebbles and puddle and outer ones, to just unify them a bit better. And I blend the two masks. Okay, I use the ambient occlusion node to basically get this radius of information, which I later subtract from the combined mask, and I plug this into the atlas to basically only scatter them around these two sections over here, because you'd obviously, well, in my example, I didn't want pebbles scattered on top of pebbles, even though that's something you can't really control too much. It's just something that you don't have the control in Designer. And of course, this is how the reference was built. Okay, and of course we've got our stones on the edge, which, as it says, we've got a mask, which, I mean, to be fair, in our reference, this is basically more like a linear trim mesh decal type thing. So in my case, I think I just placed them on the general peaks of the surface. And the way I've built these masks is using histogram selects to basically select certain ranges of the material, and I blend them with some noise to break them up, and I just clamp out the values over there using levels basically. And this is the general structure of the masks that scatter the material. Okay, and if I actually where's the height? Let's see what it looks like. So this is where the pebbles in water. You can see the outer ones, the in-between blend of them. And one important thing that I kept iterating back and forth was the height information and how much they were blending on top of each other. So this was something that you'd have to, go back and forth to see, okay, these big pebbles that are in the water need to be quite high up in the displacement value because they're quite, they're much more bigger and it's much more raised, for example, versus other ones. Give that a second to compile. And then finally, we have the microstones that if we look in the reference, you can kind of see these little squiggly chunks over here in the material. It's just another pass that I've done that I later blended. And this method, I think I used a slightly different. Oh no, I used the same method for the blending. Yeah. So it's the same way of blending them. And I do a final slope blur to just organically break up the surface a bit more. And it's very, very subtle, the detail, but you can see over here that the stones are quite clean. But when you do this, it just adds a tiny bit of erosion into them, which makes it look a bit nicer, the material. And I've got this in my reference. I don't know how well we can tell, but some of these pebbles around the edges, they almost look like they have these, they're like subtly going into the ground over here, like they're being pushed in, like compressed a bit more into the surface. And I only did this for the micro ones. All I've done is taken the mask from the Atlas scatter, ran it through a distance to push the pixels outwards a little bit. Okay. And then I subtracted from the original mask to get this kind of halo effect. Okay. And then I do some later blurring and blending, a bit of warping to break it up. And later here in this final blend node, you can't really see, but again, this is a good opportunity to look at your normal map to see what it looks like. It's very subtle, the detail, but if we look over here, it just subtly, subtracts into the ground and the detail. But again, it's a very, very subtle effect. Okay, so that's the general material in terms of the reference, but now we're going to be going over briefly, and I know I'm running out of time. So I'll try and go a bit faster over the grass. The grass, all it is just a bunch of, it's a basic shape and made a very, very thin triangle and use the splatter circular to displace them in a circular fashion. And I use I use the various amount of rings to basically create different levels of them to basically look more organic. Okay. So the same principle as before. It's using the height, normal information, opacity, and I run it through the same principle of just scattering it through a specific mask. There was no actual logic to where I placed it. I just placed them where I thought looked good, basically. Okay, and we've got a bit more of a detailed pass onto the blades of the blades, because currently when you just blend them like that, they're very noisy in the general material. When we try and see, let's see if we can find one. There you go. Yeah, there you go. You can. They're very sharp and they just don't look great, basically. But what I've done is I've taken the mask from them and I blurred it slightly to just get this type of subtle bump that is basically created around them to basically build this type of shape profile around the material. And it just made it look a bit more organic basically. And I've got these single scatter grass blades that I've scattered about, and I'm using the same principle as the pebbles where I generate this random flood fill mask to put in the metallic to basically texture it later on. Again, I'm using the same principle over here to create these subtle, tiny little bumps onto the material. Okay, and at this point, I'm fairly happy with my material. So of course, you want to be checking to see how the ambient occlusion works. And this is a good example where you can really tell if your scatter assets actually are displaced properly, because the ambient occlusion will be very, very dark on certain details like we have here. So if you just gone into, let's say, the Atlas scatter in the height scale, you've left it at 1 or 2 or 3, you will see that the ambient occlusion, and of course the 3D render, it'll be very, very dark, which is not really, potentially how it should be. Okay, so you just have to go in and just make that a bit more flat in terms of the displacement. So I've got my normal map, AO, and curvature, which I'm fairly happy with. And at this point, I'm ready to basically texture it. So I'm starting again with the soil itself. And all I typically do is start off with some large details of the general color values, like some grays, some blues, and I blend them with curvatures and typically just the actual height itself. Okay, and I start slowly introducing a bit more detail with a good vector to get this kind of, squiggly little forms and structural shapes. Okay, so you can see it's starting to add a bit of detail, and I'm not really concerned about, oh, it's too noisy, oh, it's not quite right, because there's going to be so many more details later added on. That definition is not really going to be an issue. Okay, so I'm adding various information over here to get something that looks like it's going somewhere. And I'm using a dirt. It's one of my favorite nodes to add to my materials, mainly because it adds a lot of grounding to the material. And I'll show you later on what I mean by that. At this point, I'm just picking some more features into the material and just pushing that final soil surface. Okay. And again, for the pebbles themselves, I'm exactly using the same workflow as before, but the only thing I'm changing is I'm using this mask that I've got here that you remember from my Atlas scatter to basically color every single individual pebble uniquely. So I'm using a couple of gradient maps to basically blend them, starting to add a bit of micro noise over here again from my vectors, vector warps, picking some features like the curvature, peaks and cavities, and I'm doing a final dirt pass, which I later blend on with the actual mask. And you might think, well, why are you doing that if you're actually blending it with the pure white mask? Because all of this nice detail on the edge will obviously get deleted. It's just adding a very, very subtle grounding effect to the material. Okay, and as you can see here, it's quite hard to tell what it looks like. It's quite hard to spot, but I add a bit of ambient occlusion to the pebbles to ground them a bit better, to make them a bit more defined in the material. It just gives them a better, gives them stronger shadow information where they are in occlusion, basically. And I'm basically texturing this for pretty much all of them. And as you can see, they're nicely laid out so I can easily see what's happening. So this is an important part to just make sure that you build it in an easy way to understand it for yourself, but for any potential teammates, okay, that you might be working with. Okay, so I'm adding all of my details of here. I'm adding a bit of global tint modulation, which is just generally from just some random noise that I've sort of bashed together with the actual height map and the curvatures of the surface to just break it up and actually stick to the forms of the material. But again, it doesn't have to be anything specific. It's just something to break up the surface. And it's important to look at your global, how does it look like when it tiles? Obviously, this is a material that is not going to tile very well because it's such a small area. So again, if you go back to the very beginning where you've made your Perlin noise, you'd have to increase the scale of it to make it more usable for a much larger area. So if I was to make this again, I would make this for more of a 4x4 meter surface rather than 1.5 or even 1 meter, basically, which is what more the material is basically like. And then I add my final dirt passes and edge wear to just pick out certain details. And if you can see over here, I'll try and zoom this out a bit. When you add the dirt, it just adds a bit of a nicer grounding to the material rather than just that. I mean, to be fair, I'm happy with this, but usually when I add the dirt level, it just makes it even better. Okay. And the metal edge wear, I almost treat it as an erosion node because it just picks out the details from the top of the surface. So if we look here, you've got the curvature peaks. So this is great for building like organic surfaces like a rock because you can almost pretend it's like a wind erosion type effect where it gets more desaturated and washed out. And then I'll do a final curvature blend and a ambient occlusion. And then if we look at final renders, this is what it looks like. All right. So now I'll quickly talk about the tool itself. Okay, so for context, all I've done for the tool is taken the existing material and I've basically created a single shape around it, almost like a capsule, that the pebbles can only go in that particular area. I mean, obviously, it's not perfect in every scenario, but if I just randomize it a couple of times, you can see that with a bit of work, this can be something that you can potentially, build a collection of mesh decals that you can basically use and then suggest a scene. Okay, so just to give you an idea, that initially I wanted to build this as a tool, not as a material, and this is how I end up doing it. Okay, and finally, if you're doing this for practice or just generally if you want to push your materials a bit further or you're applying for your material job, what I would recommend to do is something like potentially this to make yourself stand out when you basically build your material. And this is something that I've built in UE5, and I'll quickly open UE5 in the next 3 minutes to just show what I've done. And let that play in the background. But all I've done is I've exported the material as the tessellated geometry mesh, which you can now do in Designer by going to Scene and then Export Scene, okay? And then you can just basically export it. The only caveat that I recommend you do, check your wireframe to see how dense the polygon is. Give that a second to, give that a second there. Because even though you use nanite, this is very, very dense. Okay, so if I go to the material properties, you've got a tessellation factor over here, which is very useful to work with something sensible that's going to make your life a bit easier. Okay, so this is what I used. So if I jump into, close that, into Unreal quickly. Hopefully this isn't going to be too laggy. Let's see, is it laggy? It is quite laggy. Let me close a bunch of stuff. Let me close that. Yeah, you're gonna have to pardon the lag basically. Oh, to be fair, one thing that I didn't go over, the most, I guess, obvious thing is the actual water level itself. It's literally just a straight plug and play, like literally nothing else I've done to it. It's just as simple as that basically. So I was quite happy with that because I didn't have to do any extra work basically, which made my life a lot easier. So all I've done in UE4, UE5, imported my my mesh, created a nice little assembly scene like so, and I added a couple of these mega scans grasses, and the only thing that I've done to them is really just removed their LODs, and I think they're actually nanite meshes as well. Yes, I think they are. So obviously, when you actually render the environment or the cinematic, you don't want to have this popping of the grass meshes, which is not very appealing. So if we look at the static camera, this is what it looks like. And to me, if I was interviewing someone, two candidates, one that had just a straight up render in Marmoset or Designer versus somebody who went the extra mileage and did it in UE5, for example, in an actual environment engine where you will be doing something like that, I would 100% always hire the person who's gone the extra length to push their presentation and what they can do with the material. It's all great making a nice, pretty ball, but show me what you can do with it. Show me what it looks like in a scene. And this took me no longer than an evening to do. I possibly spend another evening to get some feedback and just to make a nice cinematic out of it. But I think it actually took me longer to make the cinematic and fiddle with all the settings and the depth of field and the timing than the actual uh, material itself. Even just doing this is more than enough, okay, to personally have on your art station. And yeah, in a nutshell, I would 100% pick somebody who displays the material in a video game engine than somebody who just does the straight up render in a material ball or cylinder. And that's pretty much it. So I hope this was somewhat informative. Like I said, sorry if I went too fast, but this will be available in the next coming days to break down and just go into the nitty-gritty of how I've done stuff. I think I worked on this for a good week and a half on evenings, to a couple of hours every other evening, is what I did. Oh, and of course the rendering of it in UE5 was like an extra couple of days, making the cinematic. So yeah. Yes, yeah. So all it is, if I type in debug and if I right click, all it is, it's a height map input that converts it to a non-map. Okay, ambient occlusion, a flat uniform color for the roughness, and a flat uniform color for the base color. Um, and the reason why I didn't use an auto levels is because I didn't want to have what I wanted to see is exactly what the levels of range on the height map looked like. I didn't want to have almost like another level of displacement that would have confused or given me a false sense of detail, if that makes sense. Like if you're working on this material and you think it's very, very shallow, which it is, and then suddenly at the very, very end, you put a auto levels to make sure you're using the full range. When you look at it in the debug, it might look way too displaced, and it might give you a false sense of, oh, actually, I need to go back and tweak some stuff to make it less flat. So I tried to kept to the raw information that was plugged in, basically. And yeah, just use the simple material transform to output. So I've worked with a fair few material artists where I've joined, later on in the project where I've had to take over some of their files for X, Y, Z reasons. And it's typically you should try and always pretend you're in a much larger team, because it's just going to make everyone's life easier. Um, Let me just make sure I read the question again. And obviously the first and foremost thing is add frames and color them, and add a simple text to what they do, because that's the only way you can really give a visual indication to, okay, this is exactly what's going on here to that particular individual. And one other thing you can possibly do is add the dot nodes that you can have if you if I just, which I'm sure you might have used, is using these to try and make them a bit more linear, the graphs. But I don't like using them mainly for the reason that when I organize my graph later on, yeah, if I have to move a bunch of nodes together, the dot node doesn't move with the input, which makes me have to select it as well. So if actually it's slowing me down in terms of organizing my graph. Okay, so personally I don't use them, but they are useful. Another thing that I can definitely recommend is when you have instances like this, for example, when you've got lines going across like so, it can be very difficult to try and figure out, okay, where are these lines going? And it's quite difficult to try and see, oh, they're actually going or here or not here. In the example of, for example, um, where I'm combining different noises from earlier in the graph, like this cloud 2 over here. If this cloud 2 was being plugged in over here, I would just make a copy of that cloud 2 because it would just keep the graph cleaner. You can obviously do it everywhere, but like I said in the beginning, they are just gonna clog up the actual graph millisecond count on how long it takes to render, and it's just gonna slow down on later usage in the scene. And even if it's just you working on it, every time you open the graph, you have to wait 10, 15 seconds. And sure, that might not be a lot, but when you change something from the very get-go here, like this Perlin noise, if I change the disorder, it's going to take a good couple of seconds for everything down the chain to update. So it's only going to slow you down. Um, Let me just read the question again to make sure I've understood it. I think the one of the most important ones is trying to get as quick as possible to the general forms of structure and definition of the material to try and show that to be like, hey, is this going in the right direction? Because you don't want to be spending 3-4 days on a material only to be told at the very end, oh, actually, Stefan, that's not what I meant. It should have been more like X, Y, and Z. Yes, if you're not sure, you should be asking and making sure, oh, is there anything that I should make sure I stick to when building this particular material? And typically you'd be told, oh, make sure you keep to the large forms or the general structure of the big pebbles, and of course the art Bible when you're in production setting is what I'd recommend. So yeah, just make sure you try and get to that 70-80% of the material in the height map before you do any coloring as fast as possible to just try and get feedback. It doesn't have to even be to your art director, just somebody that can take another look that they've never seen your material to be like, oh, actually, yeah, you're going the right way to make sure you're not wasting time. I hope that answers the question.